Several weeks ago, Nehemiah Gordon started a firestorm when he released what he had found more than 18 years earlier. While searching the microfilm archives at Hebrew University, that's when he first came across the Hebrew Gospels. Not only was he looking for the Hebrew Matthew, but he found other Gospels that no one had looked at these manuscripts before. When he took the microfilm back to the librarian after finding the Hebrew Gospels, these other Gospels, the librarian asked him a question. Did you find anything interesting in that microfilm? And he didn't want to answer because he did not know who knew about this. And he said to the librarian, why do you ask? And the librarian says that no one has ever checked that out. No one has ever seen this documentation before. He was the first one to look at it because anything that is done in Hebrew in the Gospels, this is of no concern to Hebrew scholars for the most part. And it's of no concern to Christian scholars because they have stood on the ground that the Gospels were all done in Greek and all the scholarship has been done in Greek. And even though we have 250,000 variations in the 5,000 Greek manuscripts that exist, and there are questions that are posed that were not answerable until the ancient Hebrew text of the Gospel of Matthew came out. And so there are literally treasures that have been hidden for hundreds, yes, for now more than 1,000 years, 2,000 years, that our guest on this program has been deciphering and tracing these things back. And so I've asked Miles Jones to come back. He's a PhD in linguistics, a PhD in education, and he is the one that deciphered the code, the writing of God that is at Mount Sinai. And Miles, it's good to have you back with us.
It's good to be here.
And I'm excited about this, what you're doing right now. I know that you're in the middle of writing a book at this point.
Right.
And when we talked on the phone, you decided that it was more important to get this message out than to wait for the completion of the book. And I appreciate that. I want to have you back on when the book is completed and for you to continue this adventure because this has only just begun at this point.
Well, thanks for that. I appreciate it. And I will be back. There will be more. There will be more. I had prophesied a long time ago that when I started this 5 years ago, that once the cat was out of the bag, the Hebrew Gospels were out there, all of the libraries and churches and museums that are sitting on copies of it, because it is a forbidden manuscript. Remember, the Messianic church has been hunted to extinction, they thought, and the Hebrew Gospels were targeted for extinction because they were a threat to the authority of the church, to Greek primacy, to Greek scripture, to the Greek church, to Latin primacy, to the Latin church, the Roman church. So it has been targeted. But, you know, the church is a spiritual battleground. There were a lot of people that did not agree with that, and they hid their copies in the sub basement, if you will. In fact, the Hebrew Gospels that I am translating, and have been for the past 5 years, were bound beneath a 100-page document in Hebrew called the Tales of Sindabar. So unless you read the first 100 pages, you didn't realize there was a Hebrew Gospels there of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
It was underneath that, under the pages. It was all bound together, a codex that was bound together. And so this is just overlooked.
For 500 years in the belly of the beast, in the Vatican itself. And I really believe that, you know, attitudes changed after the Holocaust. There's been a lot more openness on the part of the church. They're not threatened anymore by this, which is good. It's progressive. It's good. Give them credit where credit is due. They have been open about this. The Vatican has released this document to me so I could study it, and other documents that we're talking about. It's been so exciting the past few weeks because they're starting to pop up like flowers in the spring. Exactly like I said, once the cat is out of the bag, there's no reason to sit on these valuable documents anymore that were forbidden by the church. Now the Vatican leading the way, that is starting to happen. So Nehemiah and I have been busy. Nehemiah was studying the oldest manuscript of the Hebrew Gospels, the Shem Tov manuscript of Matthew. And I was studying the second oldest about 100 years later, but done in the same area of Spain, Catalan, ancient Sepharad. And when we got our energies together, it was a pretty, lots of sparks were flying.
Well, we have from the Vatican Library, we actually had the photographs of the manuscripts, and we're working right now to get the permission for publication so that everyone can have these. Nehemiah is working on this in an attempt to do a coffee table book to where we not only have the photographs on parchment as far as the Gospels are concerned, but also the modern transcription and the modern translation. He's already been working on this in the book of Revelation from the British Library, but for believers to have it, especially Messianic Jews in this generation, to have those ancient documents reproduced, have this on the coffee table, this is going to open up so many incredible doors.
The most incredible is the truth of the Word, the sacred Word of God. I always tell people, that question always comes up, what difference does it make whether it's written in Greek or in Hebrew? And I say it doesn't make any difference unless you care about the truth of the Word. You know, everything gets filtered through another language, another culture, a whole nother way of thinking through Greek thought. In fact, Yeshua the Messiah himself becomes a Greek philosopher. And the differences are significant.
From that perspective, from that inaccurate perspective. You know, and as I say, okay, we have to admit that we have most of the Gospels and most of the translation have come from Greek. But the first thing we have to understand that even though these are Greek words, this is not a Greek culture. It has to be interpreted and understood through a Hebraic understanding, and that's the only way it can be done. We have so many things, the unsolvable mysteries in the Greek that are translated over to English that translators and modern readers just gloss over. They read right by. They know that they don't understand it, but they don't go back to the simplest understanding that everyone to whom it was originally addressed, they understood this with absolute clarity.
Right. Well, since the beginning of Christianity, since the beginning of the textual history of the Bible, they have been correcting it from the Hebrew Gospels in the beginning. But then once it was translated into Greek and then into Latin, they wanted to get rid of the Hebrew because it was a threat to the authority of the church.
Right, and there are so many points of clarity in the Hebrew version of the Gospels and what we see in the Vatican.
Right, there are differences.
In the first pages of Luke, what do we find that is, just about universally denied now, even among the Messianic Judaism cult, the people that try to attach rabbinic Judaism and make a Messianic version of it? They want to say that the name Yehovah was not known and no one spoke that. And here we see in the Gospel of Luke, Yod He Vav He, with all the vowel pointings.
That is the latest manuscript to come out, and it's a new one. And it's highly significant that the Messianics, because whenever you see a Hebrew gospel, we're talking Messianic scribes. Because the
that's right. That's an important thing to...
They were being prosecuted for this by the Christians, so they were burning the Hebrew gospels. And the Gentile church, the Greek church and the Roman church, they were burning the gospels and the people along with it that held to those ideas. So the Messianic church was targeted, was persecuted for 2,000 years, and the Hebrew Gospels were targeted for extinction. So the story has been that supposedly all the authors of the books in the New Testament were Hebrews, right? But yet, however, we're expected to believe that every single original manuscript was written in Greek. Does that make any sense?
Not even according to the early church fathers. They admitted. Hebrews was written in Hebrew. Duh.
And Matthew was written in Hebrew. We have to ignore all of that, because we're buying into a spin. We're buying into a narrative of the Greek church, of Greek primacy of Scripture, and that just won't hold up. It's spin. Spin was not invented in this century. It's been with us a long time. But they could enforce it with the power of capital punishment. If you didn't go along with what they said, you would burn at the stake and your manuscripts along with you. So the manuscripts themselves, the Hebrew Gospels, are the primary landmark, the primary markers of the greatest story never told. The survival of the Messianic church underground throughout 2,000 years. They mark what it is, where it happened, and what happened, because only Messianic scribes are going to be, because they're risking their lives. You'd be burned at the stake for this. Not only it was absolutely against church doctrine, it was a mortal sin to translate the Bible into the vernacular, into the language. That would be Hebrew, of course, or Romant, or any of the languages of the people that wanted to read the Bible.
And that continued on down, right down, even the translation over into English. They were burning people at the stake. They were executing them for trying to get the language of the Bible into the common parlance, so what everyone spoke on the street.
Even just for reading it in the vernacular language, you could be burned at the stake. And
so you imagine what it was. And that's why they thought that all of the extant copies of Matthew had been obliterated by the time of Diocletian.
They certainly tried. However, this
and that was what was thought, and they tried to lay that thing out, that's what happened. But we know that the persecution by Rome to obliterate these manuscripts, that was a very real thing.
Oh, absolutely.
That thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of believers lost their lives for trying to maintain. And so that's why I say every word that we got, even in King James, this is not to be treated lightly. This was written in blood.
Yes, it is. Probably about 1 million Christians have been martyred by the church itself over that time. They say, church history says, that the persecution of the Christians ended with Constantine, but that is a totally false statement. It just morphed. And now it was the church itself that was executing fellow congregants in order to achieve doctrinal purity, right? In order to win the doctrinal lottery, because the church that won, whose doctrine won out, was going to sit in the seat of power over all the churches of the earth. That's what they thought.
That's right. And that's why the Pope, or it was Constantine, who named himself Pontifex Maximus, which is the title of the high priest of paganism. But then it went from there to where he was Almighty God upon the earth. He was the vicar, vicariously Christ.
Right.
Almighty God upon the earth, and his authority is not to be challenged.
He called himself the 13th apostle. In fact, he created a huge church with 12 coffins around where he was the leader, or symbolic of the leader in place of the Messiah. And he tried to get the remains of all the apostles to put in these coffins. And the hubris is pretty breathtaking, right? But all kings claimed their authority by divine right. So why should we be surprised that Christianity was used in this way? And Eusebius tried to create this myth. He was the one, Eusebius of Caesarea, who was a flunky, I guess is the word, of Constantine. He wrote the life of Constantine, he wrote the history of the church, he wrote the book In Praise
he was the bishop of Constantine.
He
was a flunky of the truth.
Right. But he created the 3.5-year ministry, which had never been thought of before, which you talked about in the chronological Gospels, and proved definitively that it could not have been a 3.5-year ministry.
Right. Well, it
was a 70-week ministry.
And that's something that you spent a great deal of time researching on, because it took me 20 years to ferret that thing out, that it is impossible to put together the Gospels with a 3.5-year ministry. It's nonsense.
It contradicts the testimony of the other 3 Gospels. And even in John, they never mention any of the feast days more than one time. If it was 3.5 years, you would have 4 Passovers. You'd have 3 Sukkot. You would have all of these, and they never mentioned more than one time. It was clearly a 1-year gospel. John 6:4 was an insertion mistakenly by a Greek copyist or perhaps by Eusebius himself to promulgate the 3.5-year ministry because it signaled the end times when the Messiah would return. He would rule over all the nations of the earth, and he would end the persecution of Christians. Well, who did that? Constantine.
So he is the vicar of Christ who's finally returned to his throne in Rome, not in Jerusalem, but in Rome, to rule over mankind.
But he was not the Messiah. He was a false Messiah because he took the bishops up on a tall mountaintop, symbolically, and said, if you will just bow down to me, I will make the church the premier religion of the world. And they bowed down to him, right? And that's what happened. And at that point,
isn't that what Satan took Yeshua up to to a high peak and said, "Bow down to me, and all these kingdoms will be yours"?
That's exactly my point. That's exactly my point. So, what did Constantine do that we know he was a false Messiah? Well, this is when up until then, the Messianic Church and later the Nazarene Church and the Apostolic Church were a part of the Judaic religion. All Christians, whether Jews or Gentiles, were really considered a part of Judaism. It was a sect of Judaism. It was accepted as such. It was Constantine who finally finalized the divorce. It had growing anti-Semitism. Constantine effected the divorce. From now on, all Messianic believers, Jewish or otherwise, would be considered heretics. They would be burned and their books would be burned along with them, and that is the pattern that they pursued for the next 2,000 years of persecution of the Messianic Church. But they failed to extinguish it. The churches survived. They sparked the Reformation. They also sparked the Renaissance because, they had put they had forbidden, really, the study of Hebrew and the study of Greek. So how did they do that? So we lost all the Greek masterpieces that formed the model of Western civilization. That's why they called it the Dark Ages. They came back in from the East through Arabic translations that were translated by Messianic scribes in the Messianic Church, the resurgent Messianic Church in Spain. So it played a huge part in sparking the Renaissance and the Reformation. So it was, the church has been there all along. It's been a really important factor in the survival of the true word, because they had gospels that they held on to outside of the long arm, the grip of the Roman Church, which was trying its best to burn them all. And how would they do that? Because they don't know Hebrew, right? They don't even want anybody studying Hebrew. So how would they do that? Well, they just burnt all Hebrew manuscripts. So for a period literally of 1,000 years from the time of Yeshua, HaMashiach, there were no Hebrew manuscripts. Now remember, this is from a society that has been the most literate society in history. The Jews, right? And the Messianic Jews had the same educational tradition. No Hebrew manuscripts at all. Zero. Zip. For 1,000 years, they were all burned, right? Until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, and they date to the 2nd century, so that reduces it to an 800-year period of absolute silence on Hebrew manuscripts. But obviously they were stashed away because they're afraid of them being destroyed. So this discovery now of the Hebrew Gospels is just epic. It is so exciting. This is a story, I call it the greatest story never told.
I don't think I'm going to let you completely steal that one because really, that
may have
fits
stolen
so
it
much.
from you already.
that fits so much with the Gospels. Because nobody is teaching what Yeshua taught. And that's what he said. He told his disciples, you make disciples and teach them what I taught you. Yes. Instead, what we get are sweet baby Jesus stories and all sorts of insipid drivel that is passed off instead of teaching what he taught, because that is the gospel of the kingdom. And this is where the real separation with the Messianic believers in the synagogue system martyrdom because Yeshua stood up against rabbinic Judaism.
He
He
did.
stood up and vehemently violated the rules and regulations that were eventually encoded in the Talmud, but the invented rules and regulations, the takanot of the Pharisees, he stood up against, and that is why they were plotting to, and then finally delivered him to the Romans for his execution, because he was stripping their authority.
Right.
And heaven was endorsing it by these incredible miracles. Every miracle that Yeshua did, he was deliberately violating Pharisee law. And so now when the believers, the followers of Yeshua, which are called followers of the way,
right, they are.
Throughout the book of Acts, these people there's a war going on in the synagogue system to where the Pharisees are trying to hang on to their religion, and the followers of Yeshua are trying to teach the Torah clean. Right. Torah, not with all these rules and regulations added, but to separate the rules from men from the living word, which is Yeshua's instructions, which he is following exactly and showing us how to live out what Moses gave us from the mountain.
All right, so you've got these two forces there. They were trying to separate themselves from the commandments of men, the takanot, the things that have been added on to the Judaic religion, and keep what was right. At the same time, they are trying to remain imitators of Yeshua HaMashiach by keeping the feast days and the other commandments that were still relevant. Obviously, animal sacrifice and a lot of the temple ceremonies and stuff, they were abrogated with the crucifixion, the sacrifice of the Son of God. But
well, they didn't discontinue until the destruction of the temple, though. You know,
no, they didn't. That's correct. But that happened upon his crucifixion, really, and then the whole temple was destroyed 40 years later. But the temple was broken and defiled and profaned.
Okay,
upon the
so
crucifixion.
to clarify on this, the Pharisees' records tell us that the 40 years before the destruction of the temple, that the Yom Kippur sacrifice and miracle, the miracle that took place on Yom Kippur of the scarlet cord turning white, that it never happened again.
That's exactly right.
And when 40 years before, and according to Maimonides and the Jewish scholars, the destruction of the temple was in 68 of the Common Era. It was the year before the 380th Greek era that the temple was destroyed. What is 40 years before that? It's 28 of the Common Era, the year Yeshua was crucified. So when he was crucified, from that moment on, the Yom Kippur sacrifice, the miracle that happened, that heaven endorsed this, the miracle never took place again, and they still have to acknowledge this today. And if the Pharisees could wipe that out and pretend it didn't happen, they would do it. But they can't do it because they documented it themselves. This is what happened. The year Yeshua was crucified, the Yom Kippur sacrifice and miracle never happened again. And year after year, until the temple was destroyed, this was an omen. And there were several just deeply troubling omens. Right. And so this is where we have in Hebrews is that, you know, the sacrifices that were done, and this is important for people to understand, the sacrifices that were done were to remind us that we broke the blood covenant and we incurred the death penalty. So instead of being killed immediately, as God said, stand back, Moses, I'm going to kill them all right now and start with you. Instead, Moses interceded, and the Almighty then put in place the sacrifices. And that is when Moses went back up to the mount, and the Almighty gave him the detail concerning the brazen altar of sacrifices. And sacrifices were added because of the transgression, breaking the blood covenant. But when Yeshua paid that penalty, bam, no longer was that miracle shown from heaven. No longer was it acceptable, the sacrifice of that twin goat, that baby twin goat. It was shown.
The scapegoat.
That's right. It never was effectual again. And so that very moment, that is when the death penalty was paid. Yeah, exactly. And that's what it was.
And people do not realize the whole role of the Messianic church, the true church, the original church, has been totally downplayed. They were the seminal central player in the first centuries of the Christian era. The apostles went to all corners of the world, and they carried the Hebrew Gospels with them. Before Rome even became an established church.
Right. Rome's not even in the picture.
They're not in the picture yet. There were some people there, but it was, the Hebrew apostles who took it. They took the Hebrew Gospels. We have, in the early literature, we have it cited as being found in obviously in Israel, but also in Egypt, in Syria, in Yemen, in India, in Constantinople, in Alexandria, just all over the place. The Hebrew Gospels had been taken, and they were teaching from that. They were teaching from that word, from the Hebrew Gospels, and all of that is ignored. They made the seedbed of Christianity, which spread into the Greek churches, into the Gentiles, mostly Greek, and
let's trace this back for the people for a few minutes, because the apostles stayed in Jerusalem. The sent ones weren't. They didn't go up from there. They stayed in Jerusalem, and this is when Shaul was sent by the Pharisee Sanhedrin over to Damascus to continue to arrest believers, and he was sent to the synagogues.
Yes.
To arrest believers, followers of Yeshua, in the synagogue and bring them back in chains. And of course, this resulted in Yeshua appearing to him. And so finally, he comes back to Jerusalem. When he comes back, the apostles are afraid of him. But Barnabas was there in Damascus. He said, no, he's changed. He's boldly preaching Yeshua. And so you have Barnabas and Shaul who are going in and out of Jerusalem, and great things are happening. But Shaul then starts contending with these Greek proselytes, and they get all fired up because they want to hold on to their Judaism. They want to hang on to their Phariseeism, and so they're in conflict. And so then Shaul gets taken over to Caesarea, where he gets on a boat and goes up to Tarsus. But what Barnabas does is he goes up to Antioch. And it says, as the apostles spread out from Jerusalem, they went just to the synagogue, preaching only to the Jews, not the Gentiles. The Samaritans by Philip, but that didn't go very far. But it was the Messianic believers who took it to Antioch, and then Barnabas went down and got Shaul. Shaul went back there, and this is where, as you pointed out in your research, that Luke was in Antioch.
Right.
And so we have the first time that in Antioch, Gentiles are in the synagogue with the rest of the believers, and the Messianic Jews in the synagogue. And what happens with that? That's when they first became known as Christians.
Right.
So we have Gentiles. By Gentiles
they were called,
who are in the synagogue.
Notzrim, Nazarenes.
That's right, the Notzrim.
Right. And so, but that changed, that changed the church. But Paul was the apostle to the Gentiles. And many of the Jews in the diaspora had lost their Orthodox Judaism. They had lost it, but they became believers, but they did not come back to doing all the laws and the customs of the rabbinic tradition. The Orthodox believers in Yeshua in Jerusalem were zealous for the law. So you have this contradiction.
But zealous for the not only the law, but you have those who are believers who were Pharisees who are holding on to rabbinic tradition.
Yes.
And that's where a big conflict comes in.
That
it
is
will always, throughout the book of Acts.
The conflict, and that is what caused the divorce between the Greek church and the Messianic church. It is this conflict. This is why they were so upset with Paul, because they believed he was teaching this, that it was okay for them to not obey the law. Because the Judaic believers, James the Just, the brother of Yeshua, and the others, they wanted them to come back into the fold and begin to practice the law. And this is really why so many people say that the Christian church is really based more on Paul than it is on Yeshua, because he carried the banner of this outreach to the Gentiles, which was moving further and further from the law. And I'd like to show you something that I think will blow your mind.
Well, we've got to take a break right now, because as this debate is going to heat up, because I think both of us have got perspectives that are going to meld together to show these Messianic believers, Messianic Jews, as they take this message out into the world, and then you're going to have the Gentiles and especially the Romans come in and attempt to crush and destroy the authority of Yeshua and replace him with the vicar of Christ.
In the 1980s, Ron Wyatt and Jim and Penny Caldwell risked their lives to find the real Mount Sinai in the barren desert of Saudi Arabia. Today, their work is rapidly expanding biblical understanding and weaving together a prophetic tapestry with ancient documents tucked away in the Vatican.
These are the greatest evangelistic tools that we've ever had in our hands to show people the reality of the scriptures.
Michael Rood and Miles Jones uncover a Sinai mystery and reveal exciting new evidence now coming to light in Beyond Mount Sinai.
This is the tie-in to the great secret. These were alphabetic inscriptions in the oldest alphabet known to linguistic science.
Order this amazing teaching now, Beyond Mount Sinai. Call 800-788-7887. That's 800-788-7887. Or order online at aroodawakening.tv/beyond.
We're back with Miles Jones, and things are heating up here on the Rood Awakening studio because we are exploring things back in the foundation of the Christian church, as it was first called Christians in Antioch. But what was going on? These were Messianic Jews and that were going to the synagogue, and this is something Miles and I, as we were discussing this, we felt that this needed to be clarified. As we see in the book of Acts and in Shaul's letters, is that we have believers, followers of Yeshua, who were Pharisees, and they have brought with them all of their rabbinic takanot, all of this oral law that they've grown up with their whole lives, and they cannot separate the oral Torah that they were taught and the Torah of Moses. And this is where Yeshua puts the knife down. He said, I did not come to bring peace, I came to bring a sword. And he put the blade down between the law of Moses, which are the commandments of God, and the invented rules and regulations of Phariseeism, which they built an entire religious system on that. Right. So you've got believers who are still in the grasp of Pharisaic Judaism in Israel, and Shaul is making that knife point, that knife cut.
Yeah.
But now we have Shaul's writings and the teachings that were done at that time, that everyone was understanding this division that was going on. But now we've come to the point where we have Gentiles interpreting the scripture in Shaul's letters from their Gentile perspective, and not knowing that Shaul is not speaking against the Torah.
Right.
Never does.
No, and he is an observant Jew himself. But when they start, the big animosity toward him was that they said he was teaching the diaspora Jews and the Gentiles that they did not have to follow the law. And this is when they came to Jerusalem.
Right, but what was he really saying? You don't follow what law? The oral Torah of the Pharisees.
Right. Well, this all came to a head in Jerusalem, and this is in Acts 15, where they all got together and they made a determination based on the guidance of the Holy Spirit that those under the circumcision could follow the law, believers in the Messiah could follow the law, but those that were uncircumcised did not have to become circumcised, and therefore did not have to obey all of the commandments, all of the laws.
Absolutely not.
But except
no,
for four.
No. No, what James quotes, he quotes what the Gentiles have to do. He quotes it right from the Torah, that the Gentiles have got to not be worshiping other gods. They can't be committing fornication or erva matters. They can't be sexually
that has been dedicated to foreign gods.
Right. See, these are all things in the Torah. And the
yes,
whole situation is that, again, you have these anal retentive Pharisee believers who are trying to put all of the oral Torah upon the believers,
right?
Upon the Gentile believers. There are things that don't even apply to Gentile believers, such as circumcision. Since when does this sign of the covenant between God and Abraham, that all the land between from the Euphrates to the Nile belongs to the sons of Israel? Gentiles don't get in on that unless they want to.
Right.
But to enter into the covenant with Yeshua, into the renewed covenant, that doesn't require Gentiles to go under that particular thing. That's one thing. But then when it comes to all the takanot of the Pharisees, that's what everyone is saying. No, the Gentiles don't have to do that. The Gentiles. The Torah is, and this is what it says, the Torah is taught every week in the synagogue. The Gentiles want to come in and learn the Torah like they are in Antioch, in the synagogue, then they have to abstain from these things. Because if you don't agree to that, you don't even come into the synagogue. You know, if you don't want to give up your worship of pagan gods, don't darken our doorstep.
Yes, exactly.
If you want to commit erva matters, if you want to live a homosexual lifestyle, then you don't come in. That's what it's saying.
And they did. They continued to attend synagogue, sometimes church as well on Sunday, but they attended synagogue up until the 4th century when
there was church on Sunday?
There was later on, yes, the church on Sunday, the Lord's Day, right? That happened in the 2nd century. They started to split away and have different customs.
Okay, well, we're back in the 1st century, but take us through, because you've done some research in Yeshua's dynasty, the family dynasty, and tell us a little bit of what you found.
This is part of the greatest story never told, because they took a sharp right turn halfway through Acts, and after that, everything in the New Testament is basically about Paul and the Gentile church. You know, and so that's what happens after the Gospels. And they moved away from the Messianic church as fast as they could. And
the Gentiles, and they
declared the
already started to add in some of their pagan traditions.
Right, no, they did, yes. Constantine did that. Religious syncretism, Christmas, Saturnalia, Easter, the feast day of Easter, a Babylonian sex god. And those that did not follow that would not worship the resurrection of the Son of God on the feast day of a Babylonian sex goddess.
That's right.
They were declared heretics. They were called quartodecimans, which is Latin for 14, because they held to the 14th day of Nisan, which is the day that Yeshua sanctified with his own blood. As the day of resurrection, of the day of his crucifixion, and then the resurrection 3 days later. So these people were targeted for extinction.
Right, because if you've got to have Good Friday and Easter Sunday and try to get 3 days and 3 nights in there, you can't do it. So anybody that celebrates the crucifixion of Yeshua on the correct day and can calculate 3 days and 3 nights correctly, we've got to annihilate these people. We've got to kill them, and that's what they did.
Yeah, exactly.
They hunted them down and killed them. So if you could count to 3, basically, you're dead. Okay? You got to admit, whatever the Pope says, that's right.
Whatever the Pope is God. That's it. Now, what would have happened if they hadn't taken this sharp turn into the Gentile Greek church, focused all on Paul's message, the message to the Gentiles? This is what you would have seen, because the Messianic church continued, and I swear this is probably going to blow your mind. You'll never hear this from the pulpit, but the Jesus dynasty
that's why
continued.
You're here, not behind the pulpit. Okay, go ahead.
The Jesus dynasty continued to build a Messianic church, and this is all in Scripture. Of course, there's plenty of argument about it.
Okay, now we're going to separate Jesus dynasty. We're not talking talking about him and Mary Magdalene getting together and having offspring that will become the kings of Europe. Okay, we're not talking that.
We are not talking about that.
Okay,
we're
all
talking
right,
about
so,
the Yeshua dynasty. I should say.
Okay, now we've clarified that. Let's see. This is fascinating, ladies
His
and
parents were
gentlemen.
Joseph and Miriam. We know about them, Joseph and Miriam. But Joseph had a brother named Cleopas, and Miriam had a cousin, Elisheva, who married Zechariah. They gave birth to John the Baptist, the second Messiah. There was the prophecy of the two Messiahs. All the Hebrews at that time knew it. Now, Yeshua was a Messiah, but he was also the Son of God. There was a difference. But Cleopas, the brother of Joseph, he had two sons, James and John, and Jude Thaddeus, who both became apostles. So these were relatives of Yeshua who became apostles. He also had a daughter, Salome, who married Zebedee, and she had two sons who also became apostles. That's James the Greater and John, the Apostle John. Cleopas also had another son, Simeon, and Simeon took over. Now, after the crucifixion of Yeshua, the Messianic church in the very, very difficult times was taken over by James the Just, who was a very righteous man. He is a very Orthodox Jew, but he was a believer in the Messiah. After all of these people were...
Right, he was not a Pharisee as we think of Orthodox Jew today.
He was very definitely a believer.
He was a dedicated to the accuracy of the Torah and living it.
But in many ways, he was a perfect person for the times because he satisfied the Jews' fears about people leaving the law, and yet was a believer, a very strong believer in the Messiah. In fact, he was crucified for it by the temple priests. He was stoned to death by the temple priests, as were all of these descendants of Yeshua. But after James the Just was stoned to death for expressing a belief in the Messiah, they wanted him to tamp that down on Passover. Instead, he went out and said, "What do you expect me to say? He's sitting on the right hand of God and will return." So, he's the Son of God. So they didn't get what they wanted. So they had thugs stone him to death. Simeon took over the Messianic church at that point. And Simeon was the son of Cleopas and Miriam, the uncle of Yeshua. He took over the church, and he was the one who led the flight to Pella when the Romans surrounded the church in Jerusalem, and they went to Pella and saved the Messianic church. The Pharisees went to Jamnia and reorganized the Judaic church. All the other sects were wiped out. The Zealots, the Essenes, all of them were the Sadducees, were all wiped out. Only the Pharisees.
Right, the Sadducees, that's the Zadokim priests. They are in charge of the temple. The Pharisees, however, in charge of the Sanhedrin, they went up to Yavne, and that's where they started their academy. So I was just.
These are the two sinners now.
Taking objection to your terminology, Jewish church. Speaking of the Pharisees, because
you're right. They instituted Phariseeism in a large way. Before they were a sect.
Right, they were in control. All the priests are dead.
Now it became Judaism. Before they were a sect. Now it became Judaism and enforced by law. So after James the Just, Yeshua's brother, guided the church for 30 difficult years. Simeon led them in the escape to Pella, where many of them went on to Sepharad in Spain, and took the Hebrew Gospels with them. After his crucifixion, his brother Jude took over the church, very aged at this time, his youngest brother, in his 90s, probably 95 when he took over the church. And Jude's two grandsons also were leaders in the church. They were also crucified by Trajan, the Roman emperor. But one of their sons, Judah Kyrios, which means Judah of Christ, was the last Jewish Christian bishop of Jerusalem. Now, what happened under Constantine, and you don't hear about any of this.
Again, when we say bishops, do not do not think of the pointy hat. These
Right.
are leaders.
They
are
are.
men that lived, wore normal clothes like normal people do, and they were elders. They were responsible, and they were overseers. No fish hats.
No, that's exactly right. He was the leader of the movement. Later, they called him a bishop. They, reinvented the church.
Right. Yeah, part of this
He would have
stuff-
never been called a bishop in his time at all.
Right.
Ever.
And he wouldn't have worn a fish hat or anything like that.
No, he wouldn't.
Okay.
He wouldn't have done that.
But again, this is what, in our culture, everyone thinks of that. So that's why the terminology, that's why the little fight with the terminology, a little backlash from me,
but
because
that's
I
not-
know how you're using the terminology, and I'm interpreting it from a Hebraic perspective, what it's like really
Exactly.
living in Israel.
That's the whole conflict, isn't it? We've got this Greek perspective that has been laid upon us in the Bibles we all have and read, and then we've got the Hebrew perspective, which has some really significant differences. It tells
And
the
the
same
Hebrew
story.
Gospels. And the Hebrew
The Hebrew
Gospels.
Gospels, it's still the story of the Gospels. It's still the sacred word.
Right, but
there
there
some
are significant differences. Absolutely.
That are crucially important to understanding our Messiah who walked the earth and was a Jew.
In this, ladies and gentlemen, this is why we are taking these paths down here, so that, the story remains the same, except there are significant differences and undertones and things that you will never see in Greek, you'll never see in English. You'll read the English Bible and New Testament the rest of your life, unless you're reading the chronological Gospels, in which I do all the notations so you can understand it, but you'll read right past these things and never know what it's talking about.
Right. I mean, the fact is, the truth, and this is the truth, the Greek Gospels, because the Messianic church was a threat to them, they basically wrote the Hebrew Messiah out of the message and made him a Greek Christ. They wrote the Messianic church out of church history as if it didn't exist and wasn't the central player in the early centuries in spreading the word to all corners of the earth before the Rome church even came into being. And also, it wrote the Hebrew Gospels out. They didn't exist. And that's the story, even though all the early church fathers said they did. 75 attestations to them in the early church literature. Nobody said that they didn't exist. Nobody did. They were quotations
But
of the
now
Hebrew
you
Gospels.
even suggest that they do exist,
Ah.
and I'll tell
Oh,
you,
boy.
the termites come out of the woodwork.
If you're in seminary, you just better pick another profession, because you are not getting it.
Right,
you're not
you're
getting a
not
piece
getting
of
out
paper.
alive.
You're not getting it. Well, this is what really happened. This story never told, and you can see it on this chart right here. And you can see that the right side of the chart, the Greek-Roman tradition, is what we get taught. But this left part of the chart you see, and that's the Messianic tradition, started much earlier. The original church was that of the Messiah, the Messianic church. And it divided into two parts. The followers of John were the Ebionites, and they went a little different direction in doctrine, but they were believers. And then the Nazarenes were the Notzrim, were the followers of the Messiah, and the apostles were also followers of the Messiah. So they went out into all corners of the world and started the apostolic church, we call it, or the apostolic churches, which gradually most of them became Gentile churches, but not all of them.
Okay, and again, when we say the word church, it's not a stained glass pile of brick on a corner with the steeple on it. They met in the home throughout the book of Acts.
Good point. Better to say congregations.
That's
than
right.
better.
It's congregation. They got together in the circle. It wasn't like they had somebody, the holy pontiff, sitting up front disseminating information. No, everyone had a psalm, a hymn, a revelation.
Right.
It was real life, and that's why all the synagogues started in the home.
They did.
And all the synagogues are,
And that's what the word means in Hebrew. The words that mean in Hebrew were congregations, really. That in Greek became ecclesiastica and synagogu. And then they separated the meaning of those two, as one was uniquely Jewish and one was Christian. Never. That's not the way it was written in the Bible, in the Gospels. It was congregations, groups of believers. So they weren't churches. But what you have, they weren't churches in the sense of buildings. They were churches in the sense of congregants,
Right.
of followers.
Not of buildings.
So
Don't think of buildings.
It was these apostolic churches, the apostles, who took and created the Greek church. And remember, we've already been decades and even centuries down the road before there are many Greeks until they overwhelmed the number of Jewish Christians that were out there. But you had the Greek church start.
And it's just because of the proliferation
Right.
of the gospel in the Gentile world.
Everywhere.
They were catching on. And so eventually there became more Gentiles than Jews. But the Jews were the ones that gave their lives to get the good news of their Messiah out to the Gentile world. And then the Gentiles started mixing in their pagan sun worship with it.
They did. Constantine in particular, Christmas, Saturnalia, Easter, the feast day of Easter, and of course, they turned Sukkot into All Hallows Eve, the Day of the Dead, Halloween. That never quite took.
Right.
But they tried.
It did. That was really Samhain, the worship of the god of death. But then the Catholic Church tried to change it into that. They tried to sanctify this worship of the god of death. And so now we see what happened.
Yeah.
Okay, we're going to sanctify what God says can't be sanctified. Do not learn the way of the heathen. And they did what the heathen do. And now what do we see in our culture? Did the church really reform Halloween, or is it still the worship and celebration of the god of death?
Yeah.
It still is.
It is.
They couldn't do it. They didn't do it because they were disobeying the Torah.
No, they
Don't
were.
do
They
this.
were. And they did it specifically, and this is not hidden doctrine. They were openly saying they were changing the feast days in order to not be celebrating at the same time as the Jews. So you can see how that rankled the Messianic church. They were not going to start worshiping the crucifixion of their Messiah on the feast day of Easter. And so remember,
Yeah,
the viewers
they
need to
got
remember
a
that.
Good Friday when Dagon the fish god is worshipped. That's what Rome did. Instead of on the day that the Passover lamb is sacrificed, the 14th.
That's where the fish symbol comes from. But, keep this in mind. Any day is a good day to worship the Messiah. I don't care what day it is, whether it's Easter or the 25th of December. Any day is a great day to worship the Messiah. But, just be aware when your church puts on this marquee, come worship Easter with us, just remember where that came from.
Yeah, just imagine the bare-breasted god's fertility. You might as well put the front cover of Playboy up in front of the church. Come worship Easter.
So now
Messianics, that's what it is.
So now Messianics are declared heretics because they refuse. They are going to imitate Yeshua. They're going to imitate the Messiah. And they're going to worship on the feast days that are established and commanded of them in the Word.
Keep these feasts forever, because they're all, as Shaul said, these are all prophetic shadow pictures of good things to come. They are the mechanism whereby the Almighty tells us the end of time from the very beginning. These are His Kadosh Mikra, His holy rehearsals, and these rehearsals go on forever. The Feast of Tabernacles was not fulfilled when the Word is made flesh and tabernacled among us. It's not even fulfilled in the millennial reign when Yeshua tabernacles on earth and everyone must go up to His birthday party in Jerusalem for the Feast of Tabernacles, and if they don't, it's not going to rain on them.
Right.
No, it's not fulfilled until the last time when the new heaven and new earth, New Jerusalem comes down and we tabernacle with the Father and with Yeshua forever. Yivarechecha Yahovah v'yishmerecha. Ya'ir Yahovah panav elecha v'chunecha. Yisa Yahovah panav elecha v'yisem lecha shalom. B'shem Yeshua HaMashiach, Sar Shalom. Shabbat Shalom, Torah fans. Shavua Tov. Have a good week. We'll see you back here next week for the rest of the greatest story never told. Lehitrot. Bye-bye.